In this video, we're going to talk about the most basic model in all of economics, the model of demand and supply. And if you study economics, you'll find that this is really at the root of a good chunk of what we do. A lot of the explanations for why things work the way they do out there in the world really boils down to understanding demand for something and supply for something and how those two things interact. So usually in a face-to-face class, the way I would start this chapter is I would ask a hypothetical question of the class. I would ask them to consider the answer to this question. And the question is, who determines the price of the gas that you buy? When you go to the gas station and you buy some gas, there's going to be a price up there on a sign. And I want you to think about who determines that. I used to have my students fill out answers to that and give them to me. And the answers were always things like, well, it's the gas station owner. They get to pick the price. Or it's big oil companies. Or it's Congress. It's the president. Or it's a variety of different people or institutions. It turns out that the real answer to the question, who determines the price of the gas that you buy, the real answer there is nobody. Nobody's picking that. And that leaves people with this kind of weird feeling that just can't be true. But if you really understand how demand and supply work, you start to realize real quickly that has to be the right answer. That's not always the case. There are lots of different types of markets in which one side or the other, the buyers or the sellers, do have some control over the price. But in the gasoline market and the types of markets we're going to talk about in this chapter, it turns out that nobody has any control over the price. So we have to understand what's going on there, because if you go out and you drive through a town, what you're going to see is that the price of gas for different gas stations is all going to be very close to each other. It may be exactly the same in lots of different gas stations. And what that leads people to believe is that there's something behind that there's somehow maybe collusion. The firms are getting together and colluding and picking that price. So the fact that the price is the same, or at least very similar across different gas stations, creates the illusion that somebody's doing it. And so when I tell a class, no, nobody's doing that, that leaves them with kind of this weird feeling. So we need to talk about what's going on with the demand and supply model. And let's start by thinking about this word market. So I'm going to use that word a lot. We need to be very clear about what I mean when I use that word. So if we're thinking about a market, the definition that we're going to be using is that a market is just a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. There are different markets that function differently, so it can depend upon the number of buyers and the number of sellers in the market. But at the most basic level, anytime you've got buyers and sellers, you've got a market. It could be something very formal, like a store where buyers and a seller come together and things are bought in a very structured environment, or it could be something very unstructured, like somebody standing on the street corner selling drugs. As long as you've got a seller and you've got buyers, you've got a market. We're going to think about in this chapter what we call perfectly competitive markets. So we're going to think about perfectly competitive markets. Sometimes I will just call that competitive markets. Usually when I'm teaching this to a class, I try to initially use this phrase perfect competition or perfectly competitive markets until they get comfortable understanding that I mean something very particular with that. And then usually I'll kind of switch to just calling them competitive markets. Now, if I were to ask a class before we got into what I mean by this, if I were to say, what do you think I mean when I say a competitive market? Most people would say, well, this is just a market where the firms are competing against each other, where there is competition. Well, I mean something more particular than just that. So there are going to be some characteristics of a perfectly competitive market. The first one is that there are lots and lots of buyers and sellers. Lots of buyers and sellers. Each of them is going to be small compared to the size of the market. So let's write that and then we'll talk about what that means. Each is, I'm going to put small in quotes here, small compared to the size of the market. So let's talk about what that means. You are small in a particular market if the amount that you buy or the amount that you sell is small compared to the total amount bought and sold. So all of us are small in the gasoline market. We can go out and buy gasoline. Let's say you've got 10 cars at home. You can take all 10 of those cars to the gas station one day, fill all of them up, and that's still going to be a little teeny tiny fraction of the total amount of gas bought and sold in the gasoline market. So you aren't going to have any impact on the price. Your behavior is not going to drive the price up or down. And that's true for the sellers also. Each of the sellers, there are going to be a lot of sellers in this type of market. Each of them is going to be selling a small share of the total amount of gasoline sold in the market. So with a perfectly competitive market, there are going to be lots and lots of buyers and sellers, each of them small compared to the size of the market. That's the first characteristic. The second one is that the goods are identical. The goods or the service offered for sale, the good is identical. Goods are identical. Now let's talk about that for a second. What matters here is not whether or not the goods are literally identical. What matters is consumer perception of the goods. So if you think about what's going on here, the two examples that are typically used by economists as examples here are aspirin versus gasoline. Let's start with aspirin. So if we think about aspirin, if you were to go to, say, Walmart or go to some store where they sell pain relievers, and you go to the aisle where they have that stuff, what you're going to see is you're going to see that there is a whole variety of name brand aspirin, and then there's going to be a generic brand of aspirin. And the name brand aspirin is going to sell for 2 or 3 times as much as the generic aspirin. Turns out that what's in the 2 bottles is going to be identical. Now, I realize that there might be aspirin with caffeine or aspirin mixed with ibuprofen or things like that, but let's just think about just aspirin. Turns out that generic aspirin and the name brand aspirin are identical. The 2 goods there's no difference between them. One is going to have the same effect on your body as the other. And yet consumers do not believe that, or at least many consumers don't believe that. Many consumers believe that the name brand aspirin is just somehow better than the generic. And that results in there being a price difference between the 2. So that's a case where the goods are identical, but consumers do not perceive that they are. That wouldn't be a perfectly competitive market. Then we could think about, say, gasoline. Well, let's suppose you're driving down the road and you need gasoline. You need to buy some gas. Think about how you make that decision. Turns out that the gasoline sold by different gas stations, different companies, is literally different. There may be different additives, but consumers perceive it as if it's identical. A consumer that needs to buy gas pays attention to the price of the gas. they don't care so much where they get it. If there's a gas station there and they need gas, they're going to buy the gas, and they're going to buy it at whatever gas station typically has the cheapest price. So that's an example where the good is literally not identical, but consumers treat it as if it is. So what matters here is consumer perception about whether it's identical or not literally whether it is. Okay? So these two characteristics, we'll deal with these right now. These two characteristics are what I mean when I say perfect competition or a competitive market. So in this chapter, that's what we're going to be thinking about. Markets that fit into this category. Most markets don't fit into this category. So if we think about some examples of this type of market, we could think about commodity markets. So we could think about, say, the corn market or maybe the soybean market. Any commodity, you're going to have lots and lots of buyers and sellers, and the goods are going to be identical. Consumers treat corn as if they don't care where the corn came from. If you go to Walmart and you're thinking about buying some ears of corn to put on the grill, you don't go up to some Walmart employee and say, hey, I need to know whether this is North Missouri corn or is this Southern Iowa corn. You don't do that. You just see the corn there, and if you want to buy corn, you buy the corn. Okay? So consumers perceive that the good's identical. There are lots and lots of growers of corn, lots and lots of buyers of corn. So that's a good example of a perfectly competitive market. And again, lots of commodities work that way. The soybeans. Let's think of another example. The New York Stock Exchange, or any exchange where shares of stock in corporations would be bought and sold. That would be a good example of a perfectly competitive market. There are lots and lots of buyers of a stock, lots and lots of sellers of a stock. And a share of stock is just like any other share of stock. If we're thinking about, say, a share of Walmart stock, the shares are all the same. It doesn't matter when you bought the shares or anything like that. The goods are identical. And so that's a good example of a perfectly competitive market. Another good example would be the gasoline market. We've got to be a little careful with that. This would be a good example of a competitive market if we're talking about a fairly big town or any city where you've got lots of gas stations. Clearly there are lots and lots of buyers of gas, but you need to have lots of sellers. If we were talking about a small town where there's maybe only one or two gas stations, then we would see something very different in that type of situation than what we're going to see in this chapter. So gas is a good example, but we have to be careful with that one because you need to have lots of gas stations before that fits with what we're going to see in this chapter. So you can see that perfectly competitive markets are not really that common. So you might wonder, well, why are we talking about that? Well, it's a good place to start, and a lot of markets behave very close to what we're going to see in this perfectly competitive chapter. So we need to talk about this before you can think about how things work in other types of markets. What we want to do is start with the demand side of the market. So let's think about what we mean when we talk about demand. So here we're going to be thinking about the buyers. When we talk about supply, we're going to be thinking about the sellers. So when we think about demand, we need to define something first. We're going to think about what we mean when we talk about quantity demanded, which I'm going to abbreviate QD. Sometimes I use it as a superscript, sometimes I use it as a subscript, but I think that's what I'm going to probably stick with here. So quantity demanded, what we mean when we talk about quantity demanded, this is going to be the number of units that buyers are willing and able to buy. Okay? And the number of units that buyers are willing and able to buy is going to be dependent upon the price that consumers have to pay for it. And there's going to be an inverse relationship between the number of units that buyers want to buy and the price they have to pay. So what we know is that an increase in price is going to result in a decrease in the number of units you want to buy. As something gets more expensive, all other things equal, you want to buy fewer units. You don't need an economics class to know that. I can ask a principles class on day one of the class, if something gets more expensive, if we hold everything else constant, if something gets more expensive, do you want to buy more of it or less? And they'll all say they want to buy less. Here in a second, we'll talk about why. There's a very good reason for why that happens. The opposite is true. If we have a decrease in price, there's going to be an increase in quantity demanded. Okay? So as things become cheaper, you want to buy more of them. Let's talk about why that happens. First, let's talk about what we call this. We call this the law of demand. There are a couple of ways to think about what the law of demand means. The law of demand simply says all other things equal, when the price of some good or service goes up, quantity demanded for that good or service goes down, and vice versa. So verbally, that's what we mean when we talk about the law of demand. Here in a little bit, we'll talk about what demand curves look like, and we'll see that demand curves are downward sloping. And so another way to describe the law of demand is to say that the law of demand tells us that demand curves are downward sloping. More specifically, demand curves never slope upward. So that's the law of demand. Let's talk about why. Why does that happen? Well, there are two things at work here. And we're going to talk about them. In this class, we're not going to go into them. If you were to go on in economics, you would talk about what these two things look like graphically, and it's actually very interesting to look at. Here, we're just going to kind of describe the two effects that happen. Let's talk about first what we're going to call the income effect. And then we're going to talk about what we call the substitution effect. But first, let's go with the income effect. And let's talk about it in terms of what happens if the price of something goes up. So if the price of something you buy goes up, that has a negative impact on your purchasing power. And because your purchasing power has gone down, you tend to buy less. So let's think about it in terms of the price of gas. If you were to walk out today and find that the price of gas had doubled, then you're going to have less dollars in your pocket to spend on things. You're going to have to spend more on gas. You'll probably buy a little bit less gas. We'll talk about that substitution effect here in just a second. But you're going to have fewer dollars, and so consequently you will buy a little bit less gas because of that. Okay? So that's the income effect. Let's think about it the opposite direction. When the price of something you buy goes down, that leaves more dollars in your pocket to buy other stuff. And so you're going to buy a little bit more of whatever the price went down, you'll buy a little bit more of that because of the income effect. It's like you got a little raise. You may know at this point, if you've had any background in economics, that there's two different types of goods, what we call normal goods and inferior goods. And so you may be thinking, as I said that, hold it, that's not always true. And you'd be right, but we'll talk about that later. If you don't know what I'm talking about now, don't worry about it. We'll discuss it here in a little bit. So there's an income effect. There's also what we call a substitution effect. And the substitution effect says that when the price of something you buy goes up, other things become cheaper in comparison. And you tend to substitute away from the good whose price went up towards the goods that have become relatively cheaper. On the other hand, if the price of something you buy goes down, other things are becoming relatively more expensive, and you tend to substitute towards the thing whose price has gone down. So you can see that both of these effects, for most goods, both of these effects are going to reinforce this. When the price of something you buy goes up, you want to buy less of it because it has a negative impact on your income and because you substitute away from the thing that's becoming more expensive. So the income and substitution effects are really what's behind this law of demand. Okay? What we want to do is we want to think about what a demand curve looks like, and the way that we're going to approach that is we're going to start with what we call a demand schedule. And a demand schedule really just shows us the relationship between the price of the good and how much somebody wants to buy. Okay, so and we're going to think about different levels of price and how much they want to buy. So let's think about somebody, we'll call them Bill. Let's think about Bill's demand schedule. And let's suppose that we think about some different prices. We'll think about price of pizzas. Let's suppose we consider price of 0, 4, 8, and 12. And then let's think about how many pizzas Bill buys in a month. So let's think about quantity demanded. This is going to be pizzas per month. Let's suppose that if the price of pizzas is 0, Bill wants to buy a pizza every day of the month. Let's suppose he buys 30 pizzas in a month. If the price of pizzas goes up to 4, let's suppose he buys 20. If the price goes up to 8, he buys 10. And if the price goes up to 12, he buys 0. So what we see is that for Bill, the relationship between the price and quantity demanded is exactly like we've identified here. We could start at a low price and then increase price, and we would see that the amount that Bill wants to buy goes down. Or we could start at a high price and decrease it, and we would see that the quantity that Bill wants to buy goes up. What we want to do is we want to graph the relationship between price and quantity demanded for Bill. And if we do that, we're going to put price on the vertical axis, we're going to put quantity on the horizontal axis. Our prices are 0, 4, 8, and 12. Our quantities go up by 10. Let's just put 10, 20, 30. I'm not worried about whether or not the scale of my vertical axis matches up with the scale of my horizontal axis. That's not really worth worrying about. What we need to do is just simply graph the combination of points that we've got here. Let's start with a price of 12. If the price of pizzas is 12, Bill wants 0. So there's a point on what's going to end up being Bill's demand curve. If the price is 8, Bill wants to buy 10, so there's another point. If the price is 4, Bill wants to buy 20, and if the price is 0, Bill wants to buy 30, and if we connect those, we get Bill's demand curve for pizzas. The downward slope of the demand curve represents the inverse relationship between the price of the good and the number of units that Bill wants to buy. So this law of demand shows up verbally as this inverse relationship. It shows up graphically as the negative slope to Bill's demand curve. Okay? We describe anytime one thing goes up and another thing responds by going down, we describe that as a negative relationship or an inverse relationship. And so graphically it's going to show up as a negatively sloped line here. Now, we're going to be interested, when we talk about how markets work, we're going to be interested in a market demand curve. This is a demand curve for a particular person. A market demand curve is going to be a demand curve that represents lots of different people. So what we want to do is add another person here. And so we're going to add somebody else. We're going to pretend as if there are only 2 people in the market. Let's add somebody that we'll call Mary. So what I want to do is I'm going to clear off part of this board, and then we'll put Mary's demand schedule and graph her demand curve, and then we'll figure out what the market demand curve looks like. So let me clear this off. Let's think now about Mary's demand schedule. Mary's demand schedule. It's going to look like Bill's. We're going to use the same prices. Let's just call it P here. 0, 4, 8, and 12. Only Mary's going to want to buy different amounts of pizzas. Let's put quantity demanded here. This will also be pizzas per month. Let's suppose that Mary, if the price of pizzas is 0, she wants to buy 20. If the price of pizzas goes up to 4, she wants 15. If it's 8, she wants 10. And if it's 12, she wants 5. So she has different preferences for pizza than Bill does. That's fine. Let's draw Mary's demand curve. Same prices, 4, 8, 12. Quantities, I'm going to put my tick marks a little bit differently. Let's go ahead and put 10 and 20, but we're going to be using 15 and 5 in between there. So if the price of pizzas is 12, Mary wants to buy 5, so there's a point on Mary's demand curve. If the price of pizzas is 8, she wants to buy 10, so there's a point. If the price is 4, she wants 15, so there's a point. If the price is 0, she wants 20. So we can connect those and we get Mary's demand curve. And Mary's demand curve looks different from Bill's. We have to be careful with the demand curve because if I were to ask you, does Mary like pizza more than Bill? If I ask that in a face-to-face class, there is always somebody that says yes, and there's always somebody that says no. Usually there are multiple people. But you have to be careful because what you see is that it depends on the price, right? If the price is low, it appears as if Bill likes pizza more than Mary. But if the price is high, it appears that Mary likes pizza more than Bill. So we would never make any general statement unless at every price somebody wanted to buy more. I guess then we could say that one person liked it more. But we're not going to worry too much about comparing these to each other. That's not really what we're interested in. What we're really interested in is going to be the market demand curve. And so let's think about how we're going to come up with the market demand curve. We want a single demand curve that represents both Bill and Mary. So what I tell my students to do is, as you're learning how to do the market demand curve, and this will also be true with the market supply curve, I think the best way to start is to create the market demand schedule. Once you understand what's going on, you don't have to do that every time, but if we think about the market demand schedule, then it usually makes a little bit more sense. Let's think about, again, the same prices, 0, 4, 8, and 12. But now let's think about the total quantity demanded in the market. If the price of pizzas is 0, then Bill wants to buy 30 and Mary wants to buy 20, so the total quantity demanded in the market is going to be 50. If the price is 4, Bill wants to buy 20 and Mary wants to buy 15, so the total quantity demanded is 35. If the price is 8, they each want to buy 10, so the total quantity demanded would be 20. And if the price is 12, Bill wants none, Mary wants 5, so the total quantity demanded is 5. So now we've got the market demand schedule. All we need to do now is just graph that thing. So I'm going to kind of stretch my horizontal axis out just a little bit because my quantities are going to be bigger over there than they are in either of these. My prices, of course, are the exact same. I've got 0, 4, 8, and 12. So let's put our quantity down here, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And then we're just going to graph those combinations of points. So let's start up here with our price of 12. If the price is 12, the quantity demanded in the market, total quantity demanded is 5, so that point is right in there. If the price is 8, the quantity demanded is 20, so that's going to be something right about there. If the price is 4, the quantity demanded is going to be 35, so that's going to be somewhere right in there. And if the price is 0, the total quantity demanded is 50. And if we were to connect those, we get the market demand curve. Now let's think about what that thing is. That's going to be a single demand curve that represents multiple people. We're pretending right now as if we only have 2 people in the market. And I realize that in this type of market, a perfectly competitive market, one of the characteristics of this market is that there are lots and lots of buyers and sellers. So in this market, there would be more than just 2 buyers. But for ease of explaining this, we need to just keep it simple. So this is a single demand curve that represents the preferences of 2 different people, Bill and Mary. Let's talk about a different way of looking at what we're doing right here. Once you understand what a market demand curve is, you start to realize that you don't need to go through all of this process. We can actually do it a little bit more easily by just comparing 2 different demand curves. So I need to clear this off, and then we'll take a look at what's really going on when we came up with that market demand curve. All right, let's take a look at another way of thinking about this market demand curve. Let's put up here a couple of people. Actually, let's put one person over here, person 1. We don't need to worry about what we call them, person 2. We've got price on our vertical axis, quantity demanded on our horizontal axis. We've got some demand curve. I'm going to label it D. For person 1, we've got another demand curve. I'll label it D. For person 2, the demand curves don't have to look the same. That's fine. And then over here, we're going to draw a picture of the market demand curve. So here we've got price and quantity demanded in the market. So let's think about what we did when we were drawing that demand curve that we had previously. What we were doing is we were picking a price. Let's call it price. Actually, let's call this person A and person B. I think that is going to be easier to make the notation work. So that's not person X, that's going to be person B. So let's call this P1. So what we did was we picked a price, and we did it with the demand schedule first, but we didn't have to put that demand schedule together. What we did was we picked a price, we looked at the first person, and we saw how much they wanted to buy at that price. Let's call it Q1A. And then at that same price of P1, we looked at how much person B wanted to buy. We'll call that Q1B. And then that told us that over here in the market, at that same price of P1, the total quantity demanded was the sum of the amount that this person wanted to buy plus the amount this person wanted to buy. It was something out here. It was Q1A plus Q1B. And that ended up being a point on what was our market demand curve. So that's what we were doing. A market demand curve is the horizontal summation of the individual demand curves. Okay? So we looked at the prices, we picked a price, we looked at a price of 12, we looked at a price of 8, a price of 4, a price of 0. And then we just horizontally summed the quantities across Bill and across Mary, and that told us the total quantity demanded in the market. So the market demand curve is the horizontal summation of the individual demand curves. And in a competitive market, there would be lots and lots of individuals. Now, I would never give you a problem where you had to create a market demand curve with, say, 1,000 individuals. That would be too time-consuming and of no value. But you'll definitely have to do it with a couple people. So that's how you would put that together. So now we've talked about why demand curves look the way they do, why they're downward sloping. What we need to talk about now are what are the things that cause a demand curve to shift around. And I typically call these the determinants of demand. determinants of demand. These are the things that shift demand curves. I'm going to put in parentheses demand shifters. There are going to be 5 of them that we're going to talk about. The first one that we're going to think about is income. Your demand for different goods and services can change when your income changes, even if nothing about the good or service changes. So if usually in a face-to-face class, what the example I would use would be maybe to think about the number of times you go and see a movie in a month. And then think about how that number might change if all of a sudden you won the lottery and you had a big income. Probably, for most people, they would go and see more movies. Or you could think about how many times in a month you go out and eat at a restaurant. The other way to think about it would be think about the number of times you go out and eat at a restaurant. Let's say maybe it's 5 times a month. And then think about what would happen if your income went down. You'd probably go out and eat at a restaurant fewer times in a month. Now, how your demand changes in response to a change in income depends on something I just briefly mentioned earlier in this video, and that is whether or not the good is what we call a normal good or an inferior good. So let's start with a normal good. Turns out that most goods are normal goods. And a normal good is a good for which an increase in your income causes you to buy more of it. An increase in your income causes an increase in demand. So an increase in income causes an increase in demand. And again, most goods are normal goods. The goods that I gave you, going out to a movie or going out to eat at a restaurant, for most goods, if people's income goes up, they tend to do those things more often. The other side of that coin we need to put up here. A normal good is a good for which a decrease in your income causes a decrease in demand. So let's write it this way. A decrease in income causes a decrease in demand. So that's the first type of good that we're going to think about. The second type of good is what we call an inferior good. I'll say inferior goods. An inferior good is a good for which an increase in your income causes a decrease in demand. As your income goes up, you tend to buy less of these things. The other side of that coin is, as your income goes down, you tend to buy more of them. Let's write that definition, and then we'll think about some examples of that. So an inferior good is a good for which an increase in income causes a decrease in demand. The other side of that coin is a decrease in your income causes an increase in demand. So if I'm in a face-to-face class and I ask the class, somebody give me some examples of an inferior good. If I were to ask you to do that right now, I would be willing to bet that the first thing that pops into your head, I think with the exception of one semester, every semester that I have ever been teaching principles of economics, micro or macro, if I ask a class, somebody give me an example of an inferior good, the first thing that somebody volunteers is almost always ramen noodles. Ramen noodles are kind of the classic example of a good for which when your purchasing power goes up, you tend to buy less of it, and when your purchasing power goes down, you tend to buy more of it. But ramen noodles are certainly not the only example of an inferior good. There are lots of other examples. Public transportation is an example typically of an inferior good, although it depends on that. We may come back to that a little bit later. Other examples might be used clothing. For a lot of people, used clothing is an inferior good, though not for everybody. There are some people that collect vintage clothing, and for them, it's a normal good. As they get more money, they buy more vintage clothing. But for a lot of people, used clothing would be an inferior good. Or, say, generic brands. The story I always tell in my principles class is that when I was an undergraduate student, I tended to eat a lot of banquet pot pies. I thought they were the greatest thing ever, and they were relatively cheap back when I was in college, and you could go out and for less than $1 you could buy a couple of them, and I considered it a victory if I could eat a meal for less than $1. And then I went to graduate school at Iowa State University, and at graduate school, if you've got an assistantship, you're going to earn a little bit of money. It's going to be enough to pay for your graduate school and rent an apartment and have a little bit of spending money, but you're not going to have a lot of money. And so even in graduate school, I ate a lot of pot pies. And then when I graduated with my PhD and I got my first real job, and I went from making not very much to making pretty decent money, I remember thinking, if I were to ask a class right now, what do you think happened to the number of pot pies that I ate? Everybody says, it went down. But the reality of it is, I think those things are great. I still think they're great. And when I started making more money, I ate even more of them. So for me, pot pies are not an inferior good. And the whole point of that story, it really doesn't have anything to do with pot pies. The point of the story is that what might be an inferior good for you is not necessarily an inferior good for everybody else. It's not that simple. For some people, a good can be normal, and for other people, it could be an inferior good. And for you, a good might be inferior sometimes at some point in your life and a normal good at other points in your life. So, being a normal good or an inferior good is not a characteristic of the good itself, it's a characteristic of your preferences. Okay? So income is the first determinant of demand, probably one of the most important. Let's call that number one. The second determinant of demand that we need to talk about, let's talk about prices of related goods. Well, this is number two. Prices of related goods. So if you think about any two goods, pairs of goods, for most pairs of goods, there probably is not going to be any relationship between them. But if you do have two goods that are related to each other, the nature of that relationship is going to be either they're going to be substitutes for each other, where you consume one or the other, or they're going to be complements, where you tend to consume them together. So things like peanut butter and jelly, those goods tend to be complements. Things like Coke and Pepsi tend to be substitutes. So for example, with Coke and Pepsi, you don't go out and buy a Coke, let's say a 2-liter of Coke and a 2-liter of Pepsi, and then have a drink where you pour half of one and half of the other. That's not what you do. You buy Coke or Pepsi. They substitute for each other. Okay? So let's think about how these two things relate. Let's start with substitutes, and let's consider a hypothetical scenario where, let's suppose every day before class you go and you buy a Pepsi. Let's suppose there's a Pepsi machine and a Coke machine right next to each other. Let's suppose that you like Pepsi a little bit more than Coke, and so every day before class you go to the machines and you buy a Pepsi. And let's suppose that the price of each of them is $1. And then one day you walk up to the Pepsi machine with your dollar in your hand, ready to buy that Pepsi, and you see that the price of the Pepsi is now $3. Think about what most people would do in that scenario. Most people are going to, if the price of the Coke is still $1, most people are going to switch from the Pepsi to the Coke. Now, nothing changed about the Coke, right? It was $1 yesterday, it's $1 today. Nothing about the Coke changed. But what did change is the price of that Pepsi. And that increase in the price of Pepsi caused you to not buy the Pepsi and switch to the Coke. Your demand for the Coke increased. So with substitutes, that's a situation where an increase in the price of one, increase in price of one good, increases demand for the other. Increases demand for the other. Running out of space here. The other side of that coin is also true. A decrease with substitutes. A decrease in the price of one will cause you to buy more of that and less of the other. So a decrease in the price of one good decreases demand for the other. I'm just going to put a couple quotes there. Decreases demand for the other. So that's how it works with substitutes. Let's put here Coke and Pepsi. Pepsi. We could also think about two goods that complement each other. And the example that I typically use in a face-to-face class would be, say, hot dogs and hot dog buns. So complements with an E there, complements. Let's suppose that you're walking through the grocery store and you decide that you're going to grill out tonight, and so you pick up a pack of hot dogs and you walk over to buy the buns, and when you get over to the buns, you see that, much to your surprise, a pack of hot dog buns costs $20. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not buying a $20 bag of hot dog buns. So that increase in the price of the hot dog buns is going to cause me not to buy those buns, and I'm probably going to put the hot dogs back. So there, an increase in the price of the hot dog buns reduced my demand for the hot dogs. It's different from this one, right? So with complements, an increase in price of one good decreases demand for the other. Decreases demand for the other good. And again, you need to make sure that you always think about these definitions first in terms of an increase and also in terms of a decrease. With complements, a decrease in the price of one good increases demand for the other. Because if one good gets cheaper, you're going to buy more of that good, and you need more of the other good to go with it. So here, a decrease in price of one good increases demand for the other. Got myself hemmed in over here. So that's the first two determinants of demand. Let me clear this off, and then we'll talk about the rest of them.